Is there a meaning behind suffering? Today, I would like to talk about two extreme examples of suffering in life. So the first story is about this Jewish psychologist Viktor Frankl, and he ended up in Jewish concentration camp in Auschwitz during the Second World War. In this camp, he has written a beautiful book which is called Man's Search of a Meaning. This book has been with me for a few years now. I always somehow return back to it, and every time I read it, I find an inspiration in life when I go through difficult times. Back to these times of the Jewish concentration camps, when you look at it, it's the greatest recipe for human suffering, when everything a human has accumulated so far in his life, the physical and non-physical, is suddenly taken away, and nobody cares if about your own achievements, about your own wealth, about how good you are or how bad you are. You are just equal to everyone. And then you are being put into these circumstances where you have to struggle and to fight every day of your life to survive. Not to live, not to thrive, but to survive. Do you know what were the chances of survival in Auschwitz concentration camp? It was 1 in 28 people who survived. What was the driving force between these people who actually survived the concentration camps? Viktor Frankl talks about two main reactions of a human being when he is put into suffering and into a severely distressing situation. So the first reaction was to feel an extreme shock and horror. It wasn't uncommon for many inmates to think about the suicide as the only way of getting out of the situation. Now, the second reaction after the first initial one was total apathy and just losing all the faith in life. The way he describes it all is that what people were afraid the most during the life in concentration camp was to give up the hope. He described many instances between his friends when he actually saw someone given up. And let's say if a person was of a bad health and they needed medical assistance or they were close to death, they would just refuse the doctor, they would refuse to get up, and they would just stay lying on the ground in their feces. They wouldn't get up, they wouldn't wash themselves, and then they basically died. But the other instance was when the human being was perfectly healthy. Well, health is relative at this point, but they weren't suffering. They weren't having huge health issues at that point, but they would still give up. At the same time, they would also refuse to wash themselves, refuse to get up, dress, and refuse to go outside and work, and without having any basis for real health issues, they would die as well. So hope and belief and the meaning was the driving force for the survival in these harrowing and super difficult circumstances back in those days. According to Viktor Frankl, striving to find a meaning in one's life is the primary motivational source. But what actually matters the most is not the general meaning of life, but the meaning of a specific given situation. When you actually shine the light onto suffering, the suffering ceases to be suffering. It is there for a greater purpose. In any given situation, a human being can choose how to react. He can choose how to act. And the choice is not based on the conditions. It is based on the actual decision. He was writing that during this time in concentration camp, he started counting the days and the instances when he had happiness in his life. He drew like a balance sheet, and the days that were extremely difficult, the situations that were extremely difficult. And he would make a point to concentrate on the good ones rather than the bad ones. So he described this one situation when the camp supervisor was dealing the food to the inmates. Obviously, there would be a huge row of people standing behind. What was his light at the end of that day is that that supervisor didn't raise his eyes when he was dealing the food, and he would just he would treat everyone equally. He wouldn't give more to his friends or his peers or the people that he thought were more deserving. He would just equally deal the food to everyone around him. And that was beautiful. That was beautiful, to treat everyone equally, and everyone deserved the same chance of survival. The second instance of extreme suffering and how to find a meaning in suffering is Nadia Murad and her autobiography, The Last Girl. So this woman writes about her own childhood and the way she grew up in Kocho province in Iraq. She was one of the cultural groups in Iraq called Yazidi. She became enslaved back in 2014, and she was captured by ISIS during the Iraq Civil War. Many people from her own ethnical group were murdered. The men were murdered, the older women were murdered, and this was happening not during the First or the Second World War. It was happening 6 years ago, in our days, when people are obsessed by iPhones and modern equipment and cars and beautiful houses and so on. And there was this totally different life in another part of the world which we weren't totally aware of, or maybe we were briefly aware of, but it was masked under all these religious and political views and viewed as normal, or as it's relatively supposed to be like that, as we cannot do anything about it. So this girl was passed as a slave from one man to another. She was starved, beaten, sexually abused. When I was reading this book, it was really dark, but at the same time, life can be dark. It's not beautiful all the time. This was the greatest basis of one's suffering as well. According to her own tribe's religious views, a woman can be rejected or shamed if she has sexual relationship with a man, and it doesn't matter if it was against her own will. So that's why many Yazidi women decided to keep quiet about their own experiences. Many died during these horrible circumstances, but the ones who survived kept quiet, just out of fear of being rejected. But Nadia Murad decided that her own suffering will not be meaningless. She made the meaning of having enough courage to speak about this And actually, her actions made an impact in her own religious community. And they decided to accept these women, the slaves, the captured slaves, back into the community and to allow them to live a proper and normal life. So by her own decision to find the meaning in situation, to talk about it, to want to inspire changes, she changed the lives of many others. And back in 2018, she was actually rewarded a Nobel Peace Prize for her own book and for her own courage. So looking back at these two stories, it is obvious that pain and suffering can make you or it can break you, and the choice is within ourselves. So what I encourage you to do is to step back and look at the difficult situations in your life and try to find the meaning within. Perhaps your own experience can be a spark within yourself to understand others in the same situation and to be less judgmental. Perhaps it can be an inspiration to accept yourself more or love yourself more. After all, if you are still going through the difficult situation in life, you will get through it. We all do. And if you have done it already, then think about it, how great you are to have survived it and got through it. Thank you.